Sometimes the loneliest people are sitting right in front of us, and we never even notice. For 3 years, an old mountain man named Silas Corrigan sat in a wheelchair outside the general store in Cedar Ridge, watching people walk past him like he was invisible. The townsfolk believed his legs were broken and his best days were behind him. But Silas was hiding something, a secret that would change everything. When a homeless young woman named Grace arrived in town with nothing but kindness in her heart, she did something no one else had done in years. She saw him. She treated him like he mattered. What Grace didn't know was that Silas could walk just fine, so why would he pretend to be helpless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cedar Ridge sat in a valley where the mountains pressed close on 3 sides, like massive shoulders hunched against the wind. It was 1887, and the town had weathered 2 hard winters and a summer drought that left the creek running thin as a whisper. But the people endured. They always had. The buildings along Main Street stood with the same determined posture as the folks who owned them, weathered, worn, but unwilling to fall. Silas Corrigan had watched this town from his wheelchair for 3 years now. Every morning he'd wheel himself from his cabin at the edge of town to his spot outside Hemlock's general store. The wooden planks beneath his wheels knew the route by heart, smooth from use, creaking in the same places. His chair was a battered thing, constructed from ash wood and iron fittings, the leather seat cracked and stained dark from weather and time. The wheels wobbled slightly, but they turned. He was 67 years old, though his face carried more years than that. Deep lines traced his weathered skin like the contours on a map, each one earned through seasons in the high country. His hair, once dark as pine bark, had gone silver-grey and fell past his collar. His hands were broad and calloused, the hands of a man who'd worked with rope and steel, who'd skinned pelts and built shelters in country that could kill you if you made one wrong turn. Those hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair now, patient and still. The townsfolk passed him like water around a stone. Samuel Hemlock would nod when he swept the porch. Doc Wheeler sometimes stopped to ask how he was feeling, concern genuine in his tired eyes. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw might pause to mention the weather or some bit of news from the territory, but most people looked away or looked through him, as if a man in a wheelchair was already half gone from this world. Silas watched them all. He'd learned their patterns, their habits, the way they moved through their days. Mrs. Henley from the boarding house walked with her nose slightly elevated, her skirt swishing as if the dust beneath her feet was a personal insult. The blacksmith's apprentice always hurried, always late, always apologizing. The Reverend moved slowly, deliberately, greeting everyone by name whether they attended his services or not. They were decent people, most of them. Hard-working. They'd built lives in difficult country and made them hold. But 3 years ago, they'd shown Silas something about human nature that he couldn't forget, and he'd been testing them ever since. His cabin stood a quarter-mile from town, tucked against the tree line where the pines began their march up the mountainside. It was a simple structure, 4 rooms, a stone fireplace, windows that faced east to catch the morning light. Inside, hidden in the corner behind a woven blanket, stood a walking stick he'd carved 20 years ago. The wood was smooth from handling, decorated with intricate scenes of mountain life. Elk in meadows, eagles over peaks, a bear catching salmon in a stream. He'd made it during the winter after Martha died, working by firelight when sleep wouldn't come. Martha. 15 years she'd been gone, but her presence lingered in that cabin like the scent of pine sap, subtle, constant, familiar. She'd been the kind of woman who saw the best in people, even when they disappointed her. Especially then. She'd taught school in Cedar Ridge for 20 years, patient with children who struggled, firm with ones who tested her, beloved by nearly everyone who'd sat in her classroom. Silas had been a trapper and a guide back then, one of the best in the territory. People came from distant cities to hire him, wealthy men who wanted to hunt elk or see the back country. He'd led them through passes where one misstep meant 100-foot fall, shown them meadows where wildflowers grew so thick you couldn't see the ground, taken them to streams where the water ran so cold and clear you could count pebbles at 10 feet deep. He'd known every trail, every game path, every shelter cave in 200 square miles of mountain country. That knowledge lived in his bones, in the way some men knew their trade or their land. The mountains had been his cathedral, his home, his purpose. Then Martha got sick. A cough that wouldn't leave, weakness that crept through her like frost. Doc Wheeler tried everything he knew, but some things medicine couldn't touch. She died on a Tuesday afternoon in October, with yellow leaves falling outside the window and Silas holding her hand. He'd kept guiding after that, kept walking those mountains, kept living. But something had changed in him, hardened like sap in winter. 3 years ago, that hardness became something else entirely. He'd found a man in the mountains, injured and lost, half frozen from a spring snowstorm that had caught him unprepared. Silas had done what Martha would have wanted, brought him down to Cedar Ridge, vouched for him, helped him find work and a place to stay. The man's name was Curtis Wade, and he'd seemed grateful, respectful, earnest in his thanks. 2 weeks later, Curtis Wade robbed 3 homes in town and disappeared into the night with money, jewelry, and a horse that didn't belong to him. When Sheriff Bradshaw came asking questions, several people mentioned that Silas had brought the man to town. Some suggested, quietly at first and then louder, that maybe Silas had been part of it. Maybe the old trapper had set them up, used his reputation to make them trust a thief. The accusations stung worse than a blade. Silas had lived in Cedar Ridge for 30 years. He'd guided half these people's fathers into the mountains. He'd helped build the church and the school. Martha had taught their children. Sheriff Bradshaw investigated thoroughly and found no evidence connecting Silas to the crimes. He cleared Silas publicly, standing on the steps of his office and telling anyone who'd listen that the old mountain man was innocent. But the damage lingered. People who'd known Silas for decades suddenly looked at him differently. The warm greetings turned cooler. The invitations to Sunday dinners stopped coming. It was Doc Wheeler who'd said it plainest. Folks want to believe the best, Silas, but they'll settle for believing the worst if it's easier. That's when Silas decided to run his test. He wanted to know who in Cedar Ridge would help a man who couldn't help himself, who'd show kindness without expectation of return, who'd see him as a person rather than a problem or a source of gossip. So one morning, he sat in the wheelchair he'd built in his workshop and rolled himself into town. He told Doc Wheeler his legs had given out, that age and hard living had finally caught up with him. Doc examined him, found nothing wrong that he could see, but Silas was convincing. The pain was real enough, just not in his legs. For 3 years, he'd sat in that chair and watched. Watched who stopped, who helped, who looked away. He kept a ledger in his cabin, written in careful script, documenting every interaction. Most people failed his test without knowing they were taking it. They'd offer hollow sympathy or ignore him entirely. They'd drop a coin in his cup without meeting his eyes. They'd speak about him in third person while standing 3 feet away. Only Doc Wheeler passed consistently, stopping to talk like Silas was still the man he'd always been. The Reverend tried, but there was pity in his eyes that Silas couldn't stomach. Sheriff Bradshaw was fair but distant, as if he'd used up his quota of faith when he'd cleared Silas's name. Every evening, Silas would wheel himself home. Once inside his cabin, once the door was closed and the curtains drawn, he'd stand from that chair and walk. He'd pace the room, stretch his legs, maintain the strength in muscles that had carried him through decades of mountain country. He refused to let his body betray him the way people had. Then he'd sit by the fireplace and write in his ledger, adding another day's observations to the record he was compiling. A record of human nature, a catalogue of how people treated those they perceived as weak or broken. It was a bitter way to live, and Silas knew it. But bitterness had become familiar, comfortable even, like an old coat worn so long you forgot you were wearing it. That was his life, his routine, his purpose, until the day Grace walked into Cedar Ridge. She appeared on a Thursday morning in late summer, walking down Main Street with the sun behind her and dust rising from her steps. She wore a dress that had once been blue, but had faded to the color of a winter sky, patched in several places with careful stitches. Her dark hair was pulled back in a braid that reached halfway down her back. She carried a canvas satchel over one shoulder, light enough that Silas could tell it held almost nothing. She was young, mid-20s, maybe, but her eyes held something older, the kind of look that came from loss, from walking long roads alone, from learning that the world was harder than you'd hoped. People noticed her immediately. A young woman traveling alone was unusual, slightly scandalous, definitely worth talking about. Mrs. Henley watched from her boarding-house porch with narrowed eyes. Samuel Hemlock paused his sweeping to stare. The blacksmith's apprentice nearly dropped a horseshoe. Grace walked past them all with her head up, not defiant but not ashamed either. She was simply a person walking through a town, looking for something. Work, maybe. A meal. A place to rest. She walked past Silas without stopping. He watched her go, just another person who didn't see him. But then she paused, turned, looked back. Their eyes met across 15 feet of dusty street, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Not of faces, but of something deeper. The kind of recognition that exists between people who understand loneliness. Grace walked back. She stopped in front of Silas's wheelchair, and she smiled. It was a small smile, tired around the edges, but genuine. "Morning," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Mind if I sit for a moment? It's been a long walk." Silas stared at her. In 3 years, no one had asked to sit with him. They'd offered help or pity, but never companionship. "Free country," he said gruffly. Grace sat on the edge of the porch, a respectful distance away, but close enough for conversation. She set her satchel down and stretched her legs, dusty boots extending into the sunlight. "Beautiful country, too," she said, looking toward the mountains. "I've been walking for 3 weeks, but nothing I've seen compares to those peaks." Silas grunted, unsure how to respond to someone who actually spoke to him rather than at him. Grace didn't seem to need a response. She sat quietly, comfortable in the silence, watching the town move around them. After a while, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a dented canteen. "Would you like some water?" she asked, offering it to him. Silas looked at the canteen, then at her face. He was searching for the angle, the hidden request, the expectation, but he found none of those things. Just a young woman offering water to a thirsty stranger. "You don't have much," he said. "Keep it." "I have enough," Grace replied simply. "And sharing makes it more, not less. That's what my mother used to say." Something in Silas's chest tightened at those words. They were exactly the kind of thing Martha would have said. He took the canteen, drank sparingly, and handed it back. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Grace said, tucking the canteen away. "I'm Grace, by the way. Grace Bennett. Silas Corrigan. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Corrigan." They sat together for an hour that morning, not talking much, just sharing the space. When Grace finally stood to continue into town, she smiled at him again. "I hope I'll see you tomorrow," she said. "I'm here most days," Silas replied, the words coming out gentler than he'd intended. Grace walked away, and Silas watched her go. Something had shifted. Some small crack had appeared in the wall he'd built around himself, and he wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that. That evening, alone in his cabin, Silas didn't open his ledger. Instead, he stood by the window, looking out at the mountains turning gold in the sunset, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, his test had finally found someone who could pass it without even knowing it existed. Grace returned the next morning. just as she'd said she would. Silas had spent the night in restless contemplation, standing at his window long after dark, watching the stars emerge over the mountains. He'd walked circles around his cabin, testing the strength in his legs, as he did every night, but his mind kept returning to the young woman who'd offered him water without expecting anything in return. When he wheeled himself to his usual spot outside Hemlock's general store, part of him wondered if she'd actually come back. People made promises easily. Following through was harder, but there she was, walking down Main Street with the morning sun turning her faded blue dress almost silver. She carried the same light satchel, and when she saw him, her face brightened with that same tired but genuine smile. "Good morning, Mr. Corrigan," she said, settling onto the porch beside him as if they'd been meeting like this for years instead of just once. "Morning," Silas replied, his gruff tone softening slightly despite himself. Grace pulled out her canteen again and took a small sip before offering it to him. Silas accepted it this time without protest, taking a drink and handing it back. "I asked around yesterday," Grace said, gazing toward the mountains. "About work, about a place to stay. Doesn't seem like Cedar Ridge has much use for a wandering stranger." "Times are tight," Silas said. "Drought hit the ranches hard. Most folks are barely keeping their own fed." "I understand," Grace said quietly. "I've seen it in other towns too. I don't need much. Just enough to keep moving, to keep trying." "Where are you headed?" Grace was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the worn canvas of her satchel. "I don't rightly know. Away from where I was, I suppose, toward something better, if such a thing exists." "You running from something?" "From ghosts, maybe," Grace said, and there was such honest sorrow in her voice that Silas felt something twist in his chest. "Lost my parents 2 years ago to fever. Lost my brother last winter to an accident at the mill where he worked. There wasn't anything left for me back home except memories that hurt too much to live with." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small object, holding it gently in her palm. It was a locket, tarnished silver, hanging from a thin chain. She opened it carefully, revealing a faded photograph inside a stern-looking man and a woman with kind eyes. "This is all I have left of them," Grace said softly. "Sometimes I think about selling it, when I'm hungry enough. But I can't. It's like letting them go completely, you know." Silas did know. He thought of Martha's broken pocket watch, sitting in a drawer in his cabin, stopped forever at 2:47. "Keep it," he said firmly. "Some things aren't meant to be sold." Grace looked at him with something like gratitude, then carefully tucked the locket back into her satchel. "You understand loss," she said. "I can see it in your eyes. I'm sorry for whatever took from you." "Long time ago," Silas muttered, uncomfortable with the sudden intimacy of the conversation. "Doesn't matter how long," Grace replied. "Some losses never stop echoing." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that felt companionable rather than awkward. Silas found himself studying her face in profile as she watched the town move around them. She had the look of someone who'd been pretty once, before hard living had worn at her. But there was strength there too, in the set of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders. "Tell me about the mountains," Grace said eventually. "You look like a man who knows them." Silas hesitated. He hadn't talked about the mountains, really talked about them in 3 years, but something about Grace's genuine interest loosened his tongue. "Used to guide people up there," he said. "Trappers, hunters, rich folks who wanted to see country they'd only read about in books. Knew every trail, every pass, every place where the water ran clean and cold." "It must have been wonderful," Grace said, her eyes lighting up. "To live so free, to know a place that deeply." "It was," Silas admitted, and for the first time in years he felt the old longing for those high meadows, those silent forests, those peaks that scraped the sky. They talked for over an hour, and Silas found himself sharing stories he thought he'd forgotten. Grace listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions, laughing at the right moments, going quiet when the stories turned serious. When she finally stood to leave, promising to return the next day, Silas watched her walk toward the boarding house at the end of Main Street. Mrs. Henley was on the porch, sweeping with sharp, aggressive strokes. Silas couldn't hear the conversation from this distance, but he could read the body language. Grace stood respectfully, speaking quietly. Mrs. Henley's response was short, dismissive. She gestured with her broom, clearly refusing whatever Grace had asked. Grace's shoulders slumped slightly, but she nodded and walked away without argument. She didn't look defeated, just resigned, as if rejection was something she'd grown used to. That night, Silas sat in his cabin with his ledger open before him. He'd written Grace's name at the top of a new page, but his pen hovered above the paper, unable to form the words. How did you catalogue genuine kindness? How did you record someone who asked for nothing and gave freely? Finally, he wrote, Grace Bennett sees people, asks nothing, gives what little she has. First person in 3 years to sit with me because she wanted to, not because she felt obliged. He closed the ledger and stood from his chair, walking to the window. The moon was up, painting the mountains silver. Somewhere out there, Grace was sleeping in that lean-to she'd mentioned, cold and alone. She'd offered him water when she barely had enough for herself. She'd shown him the most precious thing she owned, trusting him with her grief. Silas made a decision. He gathered supplies, a wool blanket from his chest, some dried venison and hardtack from his stores, matches in a waterproof tin, a small knife. He packed them into a canvas sack, then waited until the town was dark and sleeping. Moving quietly through the night, Silas really walked, his legs strong and sure beneath him, to the edge of town where Grace had mentioned finding shelter. The lean-to was barely more than a few boards propped against a rock outcropping, open to the wind on 3 sides. He left the supplies inside, arranged carefully so she'd find them in the morning. Then he walked back to his cabin, moving through shadows like he'd once moved through mountain forests, unseen and silent. The next morning, when Grace arrived at their meeting spot, there was something different in her face. Wonder, maybe. Confusion mixed with gratitude. Someone left supplies at my shelter, she said, settling beside him. A blanket, food, matches. I don't know who would do such a thing. Maybe someone who knows what it's like to be cold and hungry, Silas said gruffly. Grace looked at him for a long moment, and Silas could see her thinking, considering, was it you, Mr. Corrigan? How would a man in a wheelchair walk all the way out there? He deflected. I don't know, Grace said slowly, but whoever it was, they have my thanks. It's the kindest thing anyone's done for me in longer than I can remember. She reached out and placed her hand gently on his arm. The touch was brief, innocent, but it sent a jolt through Silas like lightning. He couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him with affection rather than pity. You're a good man, Mr. Corrigan, Grace said softly. Whether you did it or not, you're the only person in this town who's treated me like I matter. That means more than you know. Silas grunted, uncomfortable with the praise, but something warm bloomed in his chest. Over the following week, their routine solidified. Grace would appear each morning, sit with Silas for an hour or two, share whatever she'd learned or seen. She found odd jobs, mending clothes, washing dishes at the small restaurant, sweeping floors. The work paid little, but she saved every penny with the careful precision of someone who'd known poverty intimately. She always brought something to share with Silas. Sometimes it was just conversation, sometimes a biscuit she'd earned, once a wildflower she'd picked on her walk into town. Silas found himself looking forward to these mornings with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The town began to notice. Samuel Hemlock mentioned it to Sheriff Bradshaw, who mentioned it to Doc Wheeler, who said nothing but watched with knowing eyes. Mrs. Henley made disapproving noises whenever Grace passed. The blacksmith's apprentice started greeting Grace with a shy, "Hello." One afternoon, Sheriff Bradshaw stopped by Silas's spot, hooking his thumbs in his belt and looking down at the old mountain man with something like concern. "That girl's got nothing," he said without preamble. "No family, no money, no prospects. You sure it's wise, spending so much time with her?" "I'm not spending time with her," Silas said. "She's spending time with me. There's a difference." "Is there?" The sheriff's tone was gentle but pointed. "People are starting to talk, Silas, about why a homeless girl would befriend a crippled old man." Silas felt anger flash through him, hot and sharp. "Let them talk. They've been talking about me for 3 years, haven't killed me yet. I'm just saying, be careful, for both your sakes." After the sheriff left, Silas sat in brooding silence. He knew what people were thinking, that Grace was working some angle, that she saw a lonely old man with a cabin and was trying to secure shelter. The thought made him sick because he knew deep in his bones that it wasn't true. Grace's kindness was real, her companionship was genuine, but doubt was a poison, and once introduced, it spread. That evening, Silas didn't leave supplies at Grace's shelter. He sat in his cabin, standing by the window, arguing with himself. Was he being foolish? Was he seeing what he wanted to see rather than what was real? He thought about his test, about 3 years of carefully documenting human nature. Grace had appeared and disrupted everything, offering kindness that didn't fit into the bitter categories he'd created. Finally, he opened the drawer where he kept Martha's pocket watch. He held it in his palm, feeling the weight of it, the stillness of the stopped hands. "What would you tell me to do?" he asked the empty room. Asked the memory of his wife, asked the part of himself that still believed in goodness. The watch offered no answer, but in the silence, Silas heard Martha's voice anyway, remembered from years past. "Trust isn't a weakness. Love, it's a choice, the bravest choice." Silas closed his hand around the watch, feeling the metal warm against his skin. Then he packed another sack of supplies and walked through the darkness to Grace's shelter. He was choosing to trust. It terrified him more than any mountain trail ever had. When Grace appeared the next morning, she sat beside him with red-rimmed eyes. She'd been crying. "What's wrong?" Silas asked, his gruff voice rougher with concern. "Mrs. Henley," Grace said quietly. "She told me I need to leave town, said I'm causing problems, that decent folk don't want my kind here. She says if I don't go by week's end, she'll have the sheriff run me out." Silas felt fury rise in him, cold and sharp as winter wind. "She can't do that." "She can," Grace said, wiping her eyes. "I'm nobody here. I have no claim, no rights. I'm just passing through, and if I've worn out my welcome, there's nothing I can do about it." She looked at Silas with such sadness that it broke something in him. "I'll miss our talks," she said. "You've been the only good thing about this place, the only person who made me feel human." "Don't go," Silas said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Grace blinked, surprised. "What?" "Don't go," Silas repeated, his mind racing. "Not yet. Give me a few days. Let me see what I can do. Mr. Corrigan, I don't want to cause you trouble." "Let me worry about that," Silas said firmly. "Just promise me you'll wait. Give me until Sunday." Grace studied his face, searching for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "Until Sunday," she agreed. After she left, Silas sat in his wheelchair, his mind churning. He had 3 days to figure out how to help her, 3 days to decide if he was ready to end his test, to reveal the truth, to step back into a life he'd abandoned 3 years ago. 3 days to choose between bitterness and hope. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Silas Corrigan began to plan his return to the world of the living. Silas didn't sleep that night. He paced his cabin like a caged animal, walking from window to window, watching the rain fall in silver sheets across the mountains. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind made him hope it was Grace returning, ready to talk, but she never came. He stood at his workbench, running his hands over the wood grain, remembering the winter he'd carved the walking stick. He'd been drowning in grief then. Martha 3 months dead, the cabin echoing with her absence. The repetitive work of carving had saved him, given his hands something to do, while his heart slowly learned to beat without her. Now he was drowning again, but in regret instead of grief. As dawn broke grey and cold, Silas made coffee with shaking hands. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this kind of fear, not the sharp fear of physical danger, but the deep, gnawing fear of having hurt someone who mattered. Grace's face haunted him, the way her eyes had filled with betrayal when she'd understood his deception. He dressed carefully, putting on his best shirt, the one Martha had made for him years ago. Then he reached under his bed and pulled out the tin box containing the deed to the adjacent property. He set it on the table, next to the ledger he'd been keeping for 3 years. If Grace came this morning, he'd show her both, the land he wanted to give her and the record of his bitter experiment. He'd lay everything bare and let her decide what came next. The morning stretched on. 8 o'clock passed, then 9. Silas wheeled himself to his usual spot outside the general store, though it felt different now, like wearing a costume that no longer fit. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and sharp, the mountains vivid against clearing skies. Samuel Hemlock came out to sweep, giving Silas a nod. "Storms past," he observed. "Seems so," Silas replied. "That girl came by yesterday evening," Samuel said, pausing in his sweeping. "Grace was looking for you. Seemed upset." Silas's heart clenched. "Did she say anything?" "Asked if I'd seen you. I told her you'd probably headed home before the rain got bad." Samuel leaned on his broom, studying Silas with sharp eyes. "You two have a falling out." "Something like that." Samuel resumed sweeping. "She's a good girl, Silas. Don't see many her age with that kind of character anymore. Whatever happened might be worth fixing." "Working on it," Silas said quietly. Doc Wheeler appeared next, walking slowly up Main Street with his medical bag. He stopped when he saw Silas, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Morning, Silas," he said. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Didn't sleep," Silas admitted. Doc studied him for a long moment, then sat down on the porch beside the wheelchair. "Want to talk about it?" Silas found himself telling Doc Wheeler everything, about the 3 years of pretending, about the test, about Grace discovering the truth. Doc listened without interrupting, his face thoughtful. When Silas finished, Doc was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I suspected," he said. Silas turned sharply. "What?" "That you could walk," Doc clarified. "Your muscle tone never decreased. Your reflexes stayed sharp. When I examined you that first week, nothing was medically wrong. But you were so insistent, so convincing in your pain, that I figured you had your reasons." He smiled slightly. "I've been a doctor 40 years, Silas. I know the difference between a body that's broken and a heart that's broken." "You never said anything." "Wasn't my place," Doc said. "You were hurting. Whether your legs worked or not didn't change that. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." "I've been a fool," Silas said. "You've been wounded," Doc corrected. "There's a difference. Wounded people do strange things while they're healing, but the girl Grace, she didn't deserve to be caught in your experiment." "I know," Silas said miserably. "I know that now." "Do you love her?" Doc asked bluntly. The question startled Silas. "I'm 67 years old. She's 25. It's not appropriate." "I didn't ask if it was appropriate," Doc said. "I asked if you love her." Silas opened his mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. He thought about Grace's smile, the way she listened to his stories, the wildflowers she'd brought him. He thought about how the mornings felt empty until she arrived, how his cabin felt warmer when she was in it. "I care about her," he said finally, "more than I've cared about anyone since Martha died. But it's not romantic love, Doc. It's just I don't know what it is. She makes me want to be better. She makes me remember what it felt like to hope." "That sounds like love to me," Doc said gently. Maybe not the kind you had with Martha, but love takes different shapes at different times in life. He stood up, picking up his medical bag. If you care about her, Silas, you need to make this right. Not with grand gestures or gifts of land, but with honest words. Tell her why you did what you did, acknowledge the hurt you caused, and let her decide what happens next. After Doc left, Silas sat alone with his thoughts. The morning crowds moved through town, farmers heading to the feed store, women with baskets going to the market, children running and playing in the puddles left by the rain, normal life continuing while Silas's world teetered on the edge of change. Grace didn't come. By noon, Silas wheeled himself home, his heart heavy. The tin box with the deed sat on his table, untouched. The ledger lay beside it, 3 years of careful observations, now seeming petty and small. He made himself eat, though the food tasted like sawdust. Then he sat in his chair by the window and waited, hoping to see Grace walking up the path to his cabin. The afternoon faded into evening, still no Grace. As darkness fell, Silas lit his lamps and pulled out the one thing he'd been avoiding, Martha's letter. He'd read it the night of the storm, but now he read it again, searching for wisdom, for guidance, for something that would tell him how to fix what he'd broken. Martha's handwriting was familiar, the careful loops and precise letters of a teacher. The paper was yellowed, fragile with age, but the words were clear. "My dearest Silas," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're still here, still living, still walking this world without me. I hope you're doing well. I hope the pain of losing me has softened into something bearable, something that lets you smile again, laugh again, maybe even love again. I know you, my stubborn mountain man. I know how you can hold on to hurt, how you can let it fester and grow until it becomes part of who you are. I'm writing this to tell you don't do that. Don't let bitterness win. Yes, people will disappoint you. Yes, the world can be cruel and unfair. Yes, trust will sometimes be broken. But Silas, closing yourself off from the world isn't strength. It's fear dressed up as protection. You taught me about the mountains, about how after a forest fire, new growth comes. The fire seems devastating, like it's destroyed everything, but it clears away the old dead wood and makes room for something new to grow. Sometimes our hearts need that too. Sometimes we need to let the old hurt burn away so new growth can begin. I'm not asking you to forget me or stop loving me. I'm asking you to keep living fully, to keep your heart open, to keep seeing the beauty in people even when they fail you. Because that's what makes you the man I fell in love with. Not your strength or your knowledge of wild places, but your capacity for hope. If someone comes into your life who reminds you what it's like to feel connected, to feel seen, to feel less alone, hold on to them. Silas, don't let pride or fear or old wounds keep you from accepting the gift of companionship. You deserve to be happy. You deserve to have someone who sees the good in you, even when you can't see it yourself. I'll love you always. Martha. Silas read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his weathered face. Martha had known him so well, had seen the darkness he was capable of, the bitterness that could consume him. She'd written this letter like a map, trying to guide him back to himself if he ever got lost. He'd gotten lost. For 3 years, he'd been lost in his anger and his test, in his need to prove that people were as bad as he feared. And then Grace had appeared, not as part of his plan, but as an answer to a question he'd forgotten he was asking. Martha's words echoed in his mind. If someone comes into your life who reminds you what it's like to feel connected, to feel seen, to feel less alone, hold on to them. Grace had done all of that. She'd seen him, truly seen him, not as a crippled old man or a bitter hermit, but as a person with stories to tell and wisdom to share. She'd treated him with dignity when others offered pity. She'd asked for nothing and given everything that mattered. And he'd lied to her. Not directly, perhaps, but through a mission, through performance, through allowing her to believe something that wasn't true. A knock at the door made Silas's heart leap. He stood quickly, wiping his eyes, and moved to open it. Grace stood on his porch, her hair damp from the evening mist, her face pale in the lamplight. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept either. "I'm sorry I didn't come this morning," she said quietly. "I needed time to think." "No," Silas said. "I'm the one who should apologize. I'm the one who lied, who hurt you, who—" "May I come in?" Grace interrupted gently. Silas stepped aside, and Grace entered his cabin. She saw the deed on the table, the open ledger, Martha's letter still in his hand. She looked at all of it, then at him. "You were going to give me land," she said, not a question but a statement. "Yes," Silas said. "I wanted to give you a place here, a reason to stay, not as payment or obligation, but as a gift, because you reminded me what it feels like to hope." Grace picked up the ledger, flipping through the pages. She read some of the entries, her face unreadable. Then she set it down and looked at him. "I understand why you did this," she said. "I understand the hurt that drove you to test people, to protect yourself by hiding. I even understand why you didn't tell me the truth right away. We barely knew each other, and you had no reason to trust me with your secret." "But," Silas asked, hearing the hesitation in her voice, "but I need you to understand how it felt to discover that you'd been deceiving me," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "I opened myself to you, Mr. Corrigan. I told you about my family, my losses, my dreams. I trusted you with pieces of myself I haven't shared with anyone since my parents died. And all the while, you were keeping this enormous secret. It made me question everything. It made me wonder if any of it was real." "It was real," Silas said urgently. "Grace, everything between us was real. The only thing I lied about was my legs. Everything else, every conversation, every story, every moment, that was all true." Grace nodded slowly. "I believe you," she said. "I spent all day and all night trying to convince myself that you were just using me, that I was a fool. But I kept coming back to the same truth. You're the only person who's treated me with real kindness since I lost my family. You saw me as a person, not as a problem or a charity case. That wasn't fake. I know it wasn't." Relief flooded through Silas. "Then you'll stay? You'll let me help you?" "I'll stay," Grace said, "but not because of the land, and not because I need rescuing. I'll stay because despite everything, despite the lie and the hurt, I still believe in the man I've come to know. The man who carved that walking stick, who loves the mountains, who still carries his wife's memory with tenderness after 15 years. She paused, then added softly, "I'll stay because I think we're both trying to find our way back from loss, and maybe we can do that better together than apart." Silas felt his eyes fill with tears again. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Probably not," Grace agreed, a small smile touching her lips. "But I'm giving it anyway. That's what hope looks like, Mr. Corrigan. It looks like choosing to trust again, even when you've been hurt. You taught me that, whether you meant to or not." Monday morning came with clear skies and the sharp bite of autumn in the air. Silas woke early, aware that today everything would change. He'd made his decision. Today he would walk into town on his own 2 legs and face whatever judgment came. But first, he needed to do something for Grace. He spent the morning gathering materials, canvas, rope, lumber from his shed, tools he hadn't used in years. Grace appeared at mid-morning, carrying a basket with bread and apples. "What are you doing?" she asked, surveying the supplies spread across his porch. "Building," Silas said simply. "We're going to build you a proper shelter. Not on the land I own, not yet. First, you need to decide if this is really where you want to stay. But while you're deciding, you shouldn't be sleeping in a lean-to." Grace set down her basket, her expression uncertain. "Mr. Corrigan, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," Silas interrupted. "I'm offering," And Grace, please call me Silas. Mr. Corrigan makes me feel like a stranger. Grace smiled. All right, Silas. They worked together through the morning, and for the first time in 3 years, Silas felt the full use of his body again. His muscles protested at first, stiff from disuse, but the old knowledge was still there: how to measure and cut, how to fit joints, how to make something sturdy from basic materials. Grace proved to be a quick learner and a capable worker. She held boards steady while he sawed, hammered nails with steady precision, and offered suggestions that improved the design. They worked in comfortable silence, broken occasionally by conversation about the task at hand. By afternoon, they'd created the frame of a small structure, not much, but better than what she'd had. A proper roof, 4 walls, a door that would close against the wind. "We'll need another day to finish it," Silas said, stepping back to survey their work. "But it's a start." "It's more than a start," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's the first real home I've had in 2 years. That evening, Grace prepared dinner in Silas's cabin while he cleaned and stored the tools. It felt natural, domestic, like something they'd done 100 times before. She made soup from vegetables Samuel Hemlock had given her, thick with potatoes and carrots, seasoned with herbs she'd gathered from the mountainside. They ate together at his small table, the lamplight warm between them. "Tomorrow," Silas said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I'm going to tell the town the truth, all of it. I'm going to walk into the general store on my own 2 feet and explain what I've been doing for 3 years." Grace set down her spoon, her expression serious. "Are you ready for that? People will be angry. They'll feel deceived." "They have a right to be angry," Silas said. "I did deceive them. I ran an experiment on this town without their knowledge or consent. Some will understand, most won't, and that's something I'll have to live with." "Why now?" Grace asked. "You could keep the secret longer. I won't tell anyone." "Because of you," Silas said simply. "Because you showed me that my test was flawed from the start. I was looking for proof that people were selfish, that kindness was dead, that the world had become a hard place with no room for compassion. But you proved me wrong. You proved that kindness still exists, that people can see each other without expectation of return, that hope isn't just a fool's dream." He reached across the table and took her hand, his weathered fingers gentle around hers. "You saved me, Grace, not from being crippled. I was never crippled. You saved me from becoming someone I would have hated, someone Martha would have been ashamed of." Grace's eyes glistened with tears. "I didn't do anything special. I just treated you like a person." "That's exactly what made it special," Silas said. "In a world where people walk past each other without seeing, you stopped, you saw me. And that changed everything." They finished their meal in thoughtful silence. After Grace left to return to her lean-to, soon to be a proper cabin, Silas sat alone with his thoughts. He pulled out the small wooden box he'd been working on, the gift he'd been carving in secret. The box was made from mountain cedar, smooth and fragrant. On the lid he'd carved a simple scene: a young woman standing in a garden, mountains rising behind her, wildflowers at her feet. Inside, he'd placed the deed to the adjacent property and a small cloth bag filled with seeds, vegetables, flowers, herbs, everything she'd need to start the garden she'd dreamed of. Tomorrow would change everything. But tonight, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The next morning, Silas dressed carefully. He put on his good trousers, his cleanest shirt, his sturdy boots. He strapped on the belt with the silver buckle Martha had given him for their 20th anniversary. Then he picked up his carved walking stick, feeling its familiar weight in his hand. He left the wheelchair in his cabin. He wouldn't need it anymore. Grace was waiting for him outside, as they'd arranged. Her eyes widened when she saw him standing tall, the walking stick in his hand, dressed like a man ready to face the world. "You look like yourself," she said softly. "Like the man who walked those mountains, who knew every trail and stream." "I am that man," Silas said. "I just forgot for a while." They walked together into town, side by side. With each step, Silas felt more alive, more present, more real than he'd felt in 3 years. His legs were strong beneath him, his stride steady. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains. People started noticing them immediately. Mrs. Patterson dropped her basket, apples rolling across the street. The blacksmith's apprentice stopped mid-swing, his hammer frozen in the air. Mrs. Henley stood on her porch, her mouth open in shock. Silas kept walking, Grace beside him, until they reached Hemlock's general store. A crowd had begun to gather, following them, whispering among themselves. Samuel Hemlock came out onto his porch, his weathered face showing surprise but not shock. "Silas," he said slowly, "you're walking." "I am," Silas replied, his voice carrying clearly. "I've been able to walk this whole time." The crowd murmured, voices rising in confusion and anger. Sheriff Bradshaw pushed through to the front, his hand resting on his belt. "You want to explain this, Silas?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I do," Silas said. He looked around at the gathered faces, people he'd known for decades, people who'd watched him sit in that wheelchair for 3 years, people who'd offered pity or walked past without seeing. "I owe all of you an explanation and an apology." Doc Wheeler arrived, making his way through the crowd. He caught Silas's eye and gave a small, encouraging nod. Silas took a deep breath and began. He told them everything, about Curtis Wade's betrayal, about the accusations that had followed, about how their suspicion had cut him deeper than any physical wound. He told them about the test he'd devised, about watching them for 3 years, cataloguing their responses in his ledger. He didn't try to justify what he'd done, didn't make excuses. He simply told the truth, that he'd been hurt, that he'd wanted to understand human nature at its most basic, that he'd been looking for proof of what he feared most, that people had stopped caring about each other. "I was wrong," Silas said, looking directly at the crowd. "Not about everyone, some of you did fail my test. But I was wrong to test you at all, wrong to judge you without your knowledge, wrong to hide behind a deception and watch you like specimens in an experiment." He gestured to Grace. "This young woman showed me that. She treated me with kindness when she had nothing to gain from it. She saw me as a person, not as a problem or a burden or an opportunity. She reminded me what real compassion looks like." The crowd was silent now, processing his words. Some faces showed anger, others confusion, a few understanding. Mrs. Henley spoke up, her voice sharp. "You let us feel sorry for you. You took our charity under false pretenses." "I never took charity," Silas said firmly. "I never asked for money or help. I simply sat and watched. And yes, I let you feel sorry for me. That was wrong. I apologize." 3 years, someone called from the crowd. 3 years of lying to us, watching us, judging us. What gives you that right?" "Nothing," Silas admitted. "I had no right. I was a bitter old man who'd been hurt and wanted to prove the world was as bad as I felt it was. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Sheriff Bradshaw stepped forward. "You broke no laws, Silas. Strange as this is, you're free to walk or sit as you please. But the question now is, can this town trust you again?" Silas met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "That's not for me to decide, Tom. That's for each person here to decide for themselves. I've told you the truth. What you do with it is up to you." The crowd began to disperse, people talking among themselves, processing what they'd learned. Some walked away, shaking their heads. Others lingered, thoughtful. Doc Wheeler approached, a slight smile on his face. "That took courage," he said quietly. "More courage than most men have. Or less sense," Silas replied. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Doc clapped him on the shoulder and walked away. Samuel Hemlock stood on his porch, arms crossed, studying Silas. Finally he spoke. Can't say I'm happy about being part of your experiment, Silas, but I understand hurt, and I understand the strange things it makes us do." He paused. "You planning to stay in Cedar Ridge?" "If the town will have me," Silas said. Samuel nodded slowly. "Well, you'll need supplies if you're building that girl a proper cabin. Come inside. We'll settle on terms." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. But it was a start. 3 weeks passed. The town slowly adjusted to the truth of Silas Corrigan. Some people refused to speak to him, their anger at the deception too raw to set aside. Others, like Samuel Hemlock and Doc Wheeler, treated him with the same respect they'd shown before. A few even admitted quietly that they understood why he'd done it. Silas and Grace worked together to finish her cabin. It stood on the edge of town, near his own, a simple structure but solid and well-built. She moved in on a crisp October morning, carrying her few possessions in that worn canvas satchel. The locket around her neck caught the sunlight as she arranged her new home. Silas hadn't given her the land yet. He'd tried several times to present her with the deed, but each time Grace had refused. "Not yet," she'd said. "Let me earn it first. Let me prove I deserve it." "You've already proven that," Silas had argued. "Not to myself," Grace replied simply, and Silas understood. Some things needed to be earned, not for others' sake, but for one's own. Grace found more work in town. Mrs. Patterson hired her regularly for mending. Samuel's wife employed her to help with inventory at the store. Even the Reverend asked her to clean the church and mend the altar cloths. Slowly, Grace was weaving herself into the fabric of Cedar Ridge, earning her place through hard work and consistent kindness. Silas returned to something like his old life, but different. He walked the trails again, though not as far into the mountains as he once had. He helped neighbors with repairs, using the skills he'd maintained in secret. He sat on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the peaks, feeling more content than he'd been in years. Grace visited him most evenings, sharing dinner and conversation. They'd developed an easy companionship, built on honest talk and shared silences. Silas taught her about the mountains, about reading weather and tracking game, about which plants were safe to eat and which would make you sick. Grace taught him about hope, about second chances, about how to forgive yourself as well as others. On a Thursday afternoon in late October, Silas was in his cabin when Grace burst through the door, her face pale and frightened. "Silas," she gasped, out of breath from running. "There's a man at the general store. He's asking about me, asking my name, asking if anyone knows where I came from." Silas stood immediately, his protective instincts flaring. "What does he look like?" "Tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes, has a scar across his left cheek. He told Samuel he's a marshal, but something about him feels wrong." A cold dread settled in Silas's chest. "Did he say why he's looking for you?" Grace shook her head, her hands trembling. "Samuel told him he didn't know anyone by my name. But Silas, what if he finds me? What if he's here to take me away?" "Why would a marshal be looking for you?" Silas asked gently. "Grace, is there something you haven't told me?" Grace sank into a chair, her face in her hands. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "My brother," she said quietly. "The one who died in the mill accident. It wasn't an accident." Silas pulled up a chair and sat across from her, waiting. "His name was Thomas," Grace continued, her voice breaking. "He was a good man, Silas, kind and gentle, like our father. He worked at a lumber mill in Oregon, saved every penny he could. He had dreams of buying land, starting his own business." She wiped her eyes, gathering strength to continue. "The mill owner was a man named Cyrus Blackwell. He was cruel to his workers, paid them almost nothing, worked them until they dropped. Thomas tried to organize the workers, to demand better wages and safer conditions. Blackwell didn't like that." "What happened?" Silas asked, though he was beginning to guess. "Thomas fell from a platform 3 stories up. They said it was an accident, that he'd been careless. But I knew my brother. He was never careless." And I heard things, whispers from other workers who were afraid to speak up. They said Blackwell had threatened Thomas, that they'd argued the day before the fall. Grace's hands clenched in her lap. I went to the local sheriff, demanded an investigation. But Blackwell owned half the town, including the sheriff. They refused to do anything. So I did something foolish. What did you do? I broke into Blackwell's office at night. I was looking for evidence. Anything that would prove Thomas's death wasn't an accident. I found his private ledger full of illegal dealings, stolen timber, bribed officials. I took it and left town that same night. Silas felt his chest tighten. Grace, that's theft. I know, she said miserably. I know it was wrong, but I was desperate, grieving, angry. I thought, if I could get the ledger to someone who'd listen, someone who'd investigate, I could get justice for Thomas and expose Blackwell's crimes. Where's the ledger now? Grace stood and went to her satchel, pulling out a false bottom Silas had never noticed. Inside was a leather-bound book, its pages dense with neat handwriting and figures. I've been carrying it for 2 years, she said. Too afraid to use it, too stubborn to destroy it. I kept thinking I'd find the right person, the right moment. But everywhere I went, I was afraid. Afraid Blackwell had hired someone to find me, afraid I'd be arrested before I could tell the truth. Silas took the ledger and flipped through it. His years of keeping his own records made him good at reading others, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Blackwell wasn't just a cruel mill owner. He was running a criminal enterprise, bribing judges, paying men to intimidate workers, even arranging for competitors to have accidents. This is evidence of multiple crimes, Silas said. Murder, fraud, bribery. Grace, why didn't you tell me about this before? Because I was afraid, Grace admitted. Afraid you'd turn me away. Afraid you'd think I was using you for protection. Afraid I'd bring trouble to the one place I'd finally felt safe. She looked at him with desperate eyes. I should have told you. I know that now. But I was so tired of running, and you made me feel like maybe I could stop. Silas set down the ledger and moved to the window, looking out toward town. His mind was racing, putting pieces together. The man asking about you, he said slowly. He's not a real marshal. Blackwell sent him. How do you know? Because a real marshal would go straight to the sheriff, show his credentials, make it official. A hired gun posing as a marshal would ask around quietly, trying to find his target before anyone realizes he's not legitimate. Grace's face went even paler. What do I do? Silas turned to face her, and something shifted in his expression, something hard and determined that reminded her of the mountain man who'd survived decades in wild country. You're not running anymore, he said firmly. We're going to handle this properly. We're going to take this ledger to the real authorities, and we're going to make sure Blackwell faces justice for what he's done. Silas, he's powerful. He has connections, money, men willing to do terrible things. And I have something he doesn't, Silas interrupted. I know this country better than anyone alive. I know places to hide, routes to travel, people who owe me favors from 30 years of guiding and trapping. If we need to disappear for a while, I can make that happen. I can't ask you to put yourself in danger for me. You're not asking, Silas said, echoing the words he'd spoken to her before. Now let me show you what an old mountain man can do when someone he cares about is threatened. Grace stood and crossed to him, taking his hands. Why would you do this? Why would you risk everything? Silas looked down at their joined hands, then met her eyes. Because you did the same for me. You risked trusting a bitter old man who'd been lying to everyone for 3 years. You chose to see the good in me when I couldn't see it myself. Now it's my turn to show you that your trust wasn't misplaced. A knock at the door made them both freeze. Silas moved quickly to the window and looked out. Sheriff Bradshaw stood on his porch, his face serious. Stay here, Silas said to Grace. Let me handle this. He opened the door. Tom, Silas, the sheriff said. Got a problem. Man in town claiming to be a federal marshal says he's looking for a young woman wanted for theft. Description matches Grace Bennett pretty closely. Is he a real marshal? Funny thing about that, Tom said, his eyes sharp. I asked to see his credentials. He got cagey, said he'd left them at his hotel. When I pressed, he got angry. That's not how real lawmen act. So what are you going to do? What I should have done 3 years ago, when people accused you without evidence. I'm going to find the truth before I act. Tom paused. Silas, if that girl's in trouble, I want to help, but I need to know what we're dealing with. Silas studied the sheriff's face, weighing his options. Finally, he made a decision. Come in, Tom. There's something you need to see. He let the sheriff into his cabin. Grace stood near the table, the ledger in front of her, her face pale but determined. Sheriff Bradshaw, she said quietly, my name is Grace Bennett, and I need to tell you about my brother's murder. For the next hour, Grace told her story, while Tom listened without interrupting. When she finished, the sheriff examined the ledger carefully, his expression growing darker with each page. This is serious, he said finally. Multiple felonies, including what looks like conspiracy to commit murder. But Grace, you did break the law when you took this. A good lawyer could argue the evidence is inadmissible. I know, Grace said, but I had to do something. The local authorities wouldn't help. My brother deserved justice. Tom nodded slowly. I understand that, and between you and me I probably would have done the same thing. He closed the ledger. But we've got a problem. This fake marshal, or whatever he is, he's going to keep looking for you. And if Blackwell sent him, he's not going to give up easily. What do you suggest? Silas asked. Tom thought for a moment. I need to contact the territorial marshal's office, get real federal authorities involved. But that'll take time, couple weeks at least. In the meantime, we need to keep Grace safe and deal with this hired gun who's pretending to be law. I can handle that, Silas said. Tom looked at him sharply. What are you planning? What I do best, Silas replied. Disappear into country where only mountain men can follow. Silas, you're 67 years old, and I've survived 67 years in country that's killed men half my age. Silas interrupted. I know trails the maps don't show, shelters that don't exist on any record. If I take Grace into the high country, no hired gun from Oregon is going to find us. Grace grabbed his arm. Silas, it's almost November, the weather's turning. You said yourself the high country gets dangerous this time of year. It does, Silas agreed, which is exactly why it's the safest place to be. Anyone following us will turn back when the weather hits. But I know how to survive up there in winter. I've done it before. Tom rubbed his face, torn between his duty and his practical knowledge. This is probably the craziest plan I've heard, he said. But it might work. How long would you need? 2 weeks, Silas said. Maybe 3 if the weather's bad. Long enough for you to contact the real marshals and get this sorted properly. And if this hired gun follows you, Silas's expression went cold and hard. Then he'll learn why you don't follow old mountain men into their country. Tom was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. After the sheriff left, Grace turned to Silas with frightened eyes. Are you sure about this? 3 weeks in the mountains in late fall? That's incredibly dangerous. Living with a target on your back is more dangerous, Silas said. He moved to his storage chest and began pulling out supplies: canvas for a tent, wool blankets, dried food, rope, his hunting rifle. We leave before dawn, packed light but warm. We've got a lot of ground to cover before that fake marshal figures out where we've gone. Where are we going? Silas smiled, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he looked truly alive. I'm taking you to Martha's Meadow, he said. A place I haven't been in 15 years. A place where we'll be safe while the law sorts out your mess. Grace watched him pack with practiced efficiency, saw the confidence in his movements, the sureness of a man returning to familiar ground. This wasn't the bitter old man in a wheelchair. This was the legendary guide who'd led countless expeditions safely through dangerous territory. "I'm scared," she admitted. Silas paused and looked at her. "Good," he said. "Fear keeps you careful. But Grace, I promise you this, I will keep you safe. I will get you through this. Trust me." Grace nodded, her hand moving unconsciously to the locket at her throat. "I do trust you," she said, "with my life." "Then get some rest," Silas said. "We've got a long walk ahead of us, and it starts before the sun comes up." They left Cedar Ridge in the darkness before dawn, moving quietly through the sleeping town. Silas led the way with his walking stick in one hand and a pack on his back. Grace followed close behind, wearing layers of wool and canvas, her own smaller pack containing food, blankets, and the leather ledger wrapped in oilcloth. The fake marshal was staying at Mrs. Henley's boarding house. They passed it silently, keeping to the shadows. The man was either awake or careless with his lamp oil. Either way, they didn't linger. Once past the edge of town, Silas picked up the pace. The trail led east first, toward a logging road that ran parallel to the creek. But after an hour of walking, Silas turned sharply north, leaving the trail entirely. "Where are we going?" Grace whispered. "Away from any path that man might follow," Silas replied. "We're going to use trails that don't exist anymore, routes that were old when I was young." They climbed steadily through the morning, working their way up the mountainside through dense pine forest. Silas moved with surprising speed and sureness for his age, his legs strong from 3 years of secret exercise. Grace struggled to keep up, her breath coming hard in the thin air. Around midday, they stopped beside a small stream. Silas filled their canteens while Grace caught her breath, leaning against a tree. "How much farther?" she asked. "Another 3 hours to the first shelter," Silas said. "We'll rest there, then continue at dawn tomorrow. By the time anyone figures out where we've gone, we'll be too deep in the high country to follow safely." Grace nodded, too tired to argue. She drank deeply from her canteen, the cold mountain water sharp and clean. "Tell me about Martha's meadow," she said as they rested. Silas's expression softened. "Found it on my honeymoon with Martha. We'd been married 3 days, and I wanted to show her the high country, help her understand why I loved the mountains so much. We climbed for 2 days, and on the 3rd day we came over a ridge and found it." He paused, remembering. "It's a bowl valley, hidden between 3 peaks, maybe 2 miles across, with a creek running through the center. Wildflowers grow there in summer: lupine, paintbrush, columbine so thick you can barely see the grass. Martha said it was like stepping into a painting." "It sounds beautiful," Grace said. "It is," Silas agreed. "We went back every year, just the 2 of us, until she got sick. It was our place, somewhere no one else knew about. I haven't been back since she died. Couldn't bring myself to see it without her." Grace touched his arm gently. "Are you sure you want to go back now?" "I'm sure," Silas said. "It's time. And somehow, I think Martha would approve of me taking you there. You remind me of her in some ways, not in looks, but in spirit. The way you see good in people, the way you don't give up hope." They rested another 10 minutes, then continued climbing. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The air grew colder as they gained elevation, and Grace was grateful for the layers Silas had insisted she wear. As evening approached, they reached the first shelter, a small cave Silas had used decades ago, hidden behind a screen of brush. Inside, it was dry and protected from the wind. Old firewood was stacked against one wall, left there years ago and still usable. Silas built a small fire while Grace spread their blankets. They ate dried venison and hardtack, warming their hands by the flames. "Do you think he'll follow us?" Grace asked quietly. "The fake marshal?" Silas considered. "Depends on how badly Blackwell wants that ledger. If he's paying enough, the man might try. But following someone into the high country without knowing the trails is suicide this time of year. Storm could hit any day now. Even if he's foolish enough to try, he won't get far." And if he does get far, Silas's expression hardened, then I'll deal with him. I'm too old for hand-to-hand fighting, but I can still shoot, and I know every rock and tree in this country. Any man who comes after us will be at a disadvantage. Grace was quiet for a moment. I never meant to bring danger into your life, she said. You'd finally found peace after your test, and then I showed up with all my problems. You didn't bring danger, Silas said firmly. You brought life back into a dead man's world. The danger was already out there. You just gave me a reason to face it instead of hiding. They slept that night with the fire burning low. Wrapped in wool blankets, the mountain silence deep around them. Grace slept fitfully, her dreams troubled by images of her brother falling, of the fake marshal's scarred face, of endless running through dark forests. Silas kept watch for a while, feeding the fire, listening to the night sounds. An owl called from somewhere nearby. Wind whispered through the pines, the familiar sounds of the wilderness he'd once known as well as his own heartbeat. He thought about the past 3 years, about the bitterness that had consumed him, about the test that had nearly destroyed whatever goodness remained in his heart. Then he thought about Grace, how she'd appeared like a gift, like an answer to Martha's letter, like proof that the world still held kindness. If protecting her meant facing danger, then so be it. He'd lived a long life, most of it good. If it ended protecting someone who deserved protecting, that would be a death worth having. They woke before dawn and climbed higher. The second day was harder than the first, the trail such as it was growing steeper and more treacherous. Grace's legs ached, her lungs burned, but she didn't complain. Silas watched her struggle with approval. She had backbone, this young woman. She'd make a good mountain person if she chose to stay. Around noon, they reached a rocky outcropping where Silas called a halt. He climbed a short way up the rocks and scanned the forest below them. "What are you looking for?" Grace asked. "Signs of pursuit," Silas said. "Smoke from a fire, movement in the trees, anything that suggests someone's following our trail." "Do you see anything?" "No," Silas admitted, "but that doesn't mean he's not coming. A smart tracker would hang back, stay out of sight, wait for us to relax our guard." They continued climbing. The trees began to thin as they approached the tree line, giving way to open slopes dotted with scraggly brush and exposed rock. The wind picked up, cold and constant, carrying the scent of snow from higher peaks. "Weather's changing," Silas observed, studying the clouds building to the west. "Storm coming, probably by tomorrow night. We need to reach the meadow before it hits." They pushed harder, ignoring exhaustion, driven by the need to reach shelter before the storm arrived. Grace's feet blistered inside her boots, but she didn't slow down. Silas's knees ached from the climb, but he maintained their pace. As the sun began to set on their second day, they crested a ridge and stopped. Below them, spreading out like something from a dream, was Martha's meadow. Even in late fall, with the grass turning brown and most of the wildflowers gone, it was beautiful. The Bowl Valley nestled between 3 peaks, exactly as Silas had described, the creek cutting through its center like a silver ribbon. A stand of aspens near the far side blazed gold in the dying light. "Oh," Grace breathed. "Oh, Silas, it's perfect." Silas stood still, his throat tight with emotion. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed this place, how much of his heart he'd left here 15 years ago. "Come on," he said gruffly. "There's a shelter on the far side, near the aspens. We'll be safe there." They descended into the meadow as darkness fell. The shelter was still there, a lean-to Silas had built 30 years ago, reinforced and maintained through decades of use. The roof had held, the walls were solid, and someone, probably Silas himself, years ago had stored firewood inside, protected from the weather. Silas built a fire while Grace collapsed onto the ground, too exhausted to help. When the flames were going strong, he handed her dried food and made her eat, then insisted she drink water, though she protested she was too tired. "You'll feel worse tomorrow if you don't eat and drink now," he said. "Trust me. I've done this before." Grace obeyed, eating mechanically, too tired to taste the food. When she finished, Silas helped her into the shelter and wrapped her in blankets. "Sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch." "You need sleep too," Grace protested weakly. "I'll rest later," Silas said. "Right now I want to make sure we're alone up here." Grace was asleep within minutes, her breathing deep and even. Silas sat by the fire, his rifle across his knees, watching the darkness beyond the firelight. The meadow was silent except for the whisper of wind through grass and the gurgle of the creek. Above, stars emerged in impossible numbers, brighter than they ever appeared in the lowlands. Silas had forgotten how vast the night sky could be when you were high enough to meet it. He thought about Martha, about the times they'd sat in this exact spot, watching these same stars. She'd loved it up here, loved the silence and the simplicity, the way the world fell away and left only the essential things: earth, sky, fire, companionship. "I brought someone to see your meadow," he said quietly to the darkness, to the memory of his wife, to the mountains that held her spirit. "A young woman who needs protecting. I think you'd like her, Martha. She's kind like you were, strong like you were. She sees the best in people, even when they don't deserve it." The fire crackled, sending sparks drifting into the night. An owl called from the aspens. "I know I've been lost these past few years," Silas continued. "I know I let bitterness eat at me, let the hurt turn me into someone you wouldn't have recognized. But she found me anyway, pulled me back from that edge. Now I've got a chance to do something good, to protect someone who deserves protecting. That's worth something, isn't it?" The night offered no answer, but Silas felt a peace settle over him anyway. He was where he belonged in the high country, with a purpose, with someone depending on him. It felt right. He added wood to the fire and settled in to wait for morning. Dawn came cold and clear. Silas had dozed briefly around midnight, then woken to tend the fire. Grace stirred as sunlight touched the meadow, groaning as she discovered how sore her muscles were from 2 days of hard climbing. "How do you feel?" Silas asked, handing her coffee he'd brewed over the fire. "Like I was trampled by a horse," Grace said, but she managed to smile. "How long do we stay here?" "At least a week," Silas said. "Maybe 2, depending on the weather and what Sheriff Bradshaw manages to do with that ledger. We're safe here. No one knows about this place except me. And the trail we took would be nearly impossible to follow without a guide." Grace sipped her coffee, looking out at the meadow. "It really is beautiful," she said. "I can see why Martha loved it." They spent the day settling in, gathering more firewood, checking their supplies, making the shelter more comfortable. Silas showed Grace how to set snares for rabbits and where to find edible roots. He taught her to read the weather in the clouds and wind, to know when a storm was building and when it would pass. In the evening, they sat by the fire, and Grace asked Silas to tell her more stories about his life in the mountains. He found himself sharing memories he'd locked away for years, adventures and misadventures, close calls and lucky escapes, the beauty and the terror of living in wild country. Grace listened with the attention he'd come to expect from her, asking thoughtful questions, laughing at the right moments. For a little while, they could almost forget why they were there, forget the danger that had driven them into the high country. But as full darkness fell, Silas saw movement at the edge of the meadow. A figure emerged from the tree line, stumbling slightly, clearly exhausted. Even at this distance, Silas recognized the tall, thin frame, the dark clothes. The fake marshal had found them. Silas stood quickly, reaching for his rifle. Grace saw his movement and turned, following his gaze. Her face went pale. "How?" she whispered. "How did he find us?" "Doesn't matter," Silas said, his voice hard. "Stay behind me. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." The man was walking toward them across the meadow, his path unsteady. As he drew closer, Silas could see he was in bad shape, scratched, dirty, limping. Following them through 2 days of rough country had taken its toll. The man stopped about 30 feet from their fire, swaying slightly on his feet. "You're a hard man to track, old-timer," he called out, his voice rough. "I'll give you that. You should have turned back," Silas said calmly. "This country isn't forgiving to strangers." "I'm being paid too much to turn back," the man replied. "All I want is the girl and the ledger. Give them to me and I'll leave you alone." "Can't do that," Silas said. The man's hand moved toward his belt, where a revolver was holstered. "I'm not asking, old man. I'm telling. Hand over the girl, or I'll take her." Silas raised his rifle in one smooth motion, the barrel pointed directly at the man's chest. "You're welcome to try," he said, his voice cold as the mountain wind. "But I should mention, I've been shooting since before you were born. I don't miss. And up here, nobody will hear the shot or ask questions about what happened to you." The fake marshal froze, his hand on his weapon but not drawing it. He'd expected an old man, maybe with a gun, but probably slow and uncertain. What he faced instead was a mountain man in his element, steady as stone, with the kind of calm certainty that comes from absolute confidence in one's abilities. "You'd really shoot me?" the man asked, but his voice had lost some of its bravado. "To protect that girl," Silas replied, without a moment's hesitation. They stood frozen in tableau, the hired gun, trying to decide if his pay was worth the risk, the old mountain man ready to defend what he'd claimed to protect. The fire crackled between them, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The storm that had been building finally arrived, the first drops of cold rain beginning to fall. Dawn came grey and cold, the storm still raging outside their small cave. Snow had drifted against the entrance, creating a natural windbreak. Silas woke stiff and sore, his joints protesting the cold and the cramped position he'd slept in. Grace stirred beside him, her face pale in the dim light. "Is it over?" she asked, referring to the storm. "Not yet," Silas said, peering out at the white world beyond their shelter, "but it's lighter. Maybe by midday." They ate a sparse breakfast of dried food, rationing their supplies. Silas calculated they had enough for another week if they were careful, maybe 10 days. After that, they'd need to hunt or forage, which would be difficult in winter conditions. "What do we do about him?" Grace asked. "The fake marshal." "We wait," Silas said. "If he had any sense, he spent the night under that overhang and headed down the mountain at first light. But if he's stubborn or desperate enough to still be up here, we'll know soon enough." Around mid-morning, the storm began to break. The snow tapered off, the wind died down, and patches of blue appeared between the clouds. Silas ventured out, rifle in hand, and climbed to a rocky outcrop where he could survey the meadow below. The world was transformed. Snow covered everything in a white blanket, pristine and unmarked, except for the tracks of small animals. The creek was partially frozen, ice forming along its edges. The mountains rose around them, white peaks against clearing skies, beautiful and deadly. Silas scanned the meadow carefully. No smoke, no movement, no sign of the hired gun. The man had either left or was holed up somewhere, waiting. Silas was about to turn back when he caught movement near the tree line. A figure emerged from the forest, stumbling through knee-deep snow. Even from this distance, Silas could see the man was in bad shape. His movements were uncoordinated, his path wandering. He fell once, struggled to get up, fell again. Hypothermia, Silas thought. The fool spent the night exposed and now he's dying. Grace had followed him to the outcrop. She saw the figure too. "Yes," Silas said, "and he's in trouble." "Good," Grace said harshly. "Let him freeze. He came here to hurt us." Silas looked at her, seeing the fear and anger in her face, understanding it, but he shook his head. "Can't do that." "Why not?" "He'd kill us," without hesitation. "Maybe," Silas agreed. "But if we let him die when we could save him, we become what he is. We become the kind of people who value life only when it's convenient." He started down from the outcrop. Martha would never forgive me if I let a man freeze to death when I had the knowledge to save him. Silas. He's dangerous. He's dying, Silas corrected. There's a difference. Come on, stay behind me and keep your distance. They made their way down to the meadow. The fake marshal had collapsed in the snow, curled in a fetal position, shivering violently. As they approached, Silas saw that the man's fingers were blackened with frostbite, his lips blue, his eyes glazed. "Please," the man whispered through chattering teeth. "Please help me." Silas knelt beside him, keeping his rifle ready, but checking the man's condition with practiced efficiency. Advanced hypothermia, frostbite, possible pneumonia. The man had maybe hours left without intervention. "Grace, bring blankets from the cave," Silas ordered, "and start a fire. We need to warm him slowly." "You can't be serious," Grace protested. "He tried to kill us." "He failed," Silas said simply. "Now he's dying. I won't have that on my conscience, and neither should you. Please, Grace, help me." Grace hesitated, then nodded and ran back toward their shelter. Silas dragged the fake marshal closer to a protected spot near some rocks and began removing the man's wet clothes, replacing them with dry ones from his own pack. When Grace returned with blankets and built a fire, they wrapped the man in layers of wool and positioned him near the flames. Silas forced warm water between the man's lips, a little at a time, warming him from the inside. Slowly, over the course of several hours, the fake marshal's shivering lessened. His eyes became clearer. He looked at Silas with confusion and something like shame. "Why?" he croaked. "Why help me?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Silas said, "even when it's not the easy thing." The man closed his eyes, tears leaking from the corners. "Blackwell hired me." "What's your real name?" Silas asked. "Davis, Frank Davis, from Portland." "Well, Frank Davis, you made some bad choices, but you're alive, and that means you can make better ones." Silas paused. The girl didn't steal for profit. She took evidence of multiple murders, including her brother's. "Blackwell is a killer, and you were working for him." Davis's face crumpled. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "Now you do," Silas said. "So here's what happens next. When you're strong enough to travel, and that'll be a few days at least, you're going to go back down that mountain. You're going to tell Sheriff Bradshaw everything you know about Blackwell, and you're going to testify against him if it comes to that. You do that, and maybe you can start making amends for the things you've done. And if I don't," Silas's expression hardened, "then I'll regret saving your life, and I'll make sure you don't threaten Grace or anyone else ever again. Your choice, Frank. Redemption or consequences?" Davis nodded weakly. "I'll testify. I'll tell everything I know." Grace had been watching this exchange in silence. Now she spoke, her voice tight. "How do we know he's telling the truth? How do we know he won't try again once he's better?" "We don't," Silas admitted. "But I look at him, and I see a man who made mistakes, not a killer by nature. Sometimes people need a chance to choose differently." He looked at Grace intently. "Isn't that what you gave me? A chance to choose hope over bitterness?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, we help him get down the mountain. But I'm watching him every second." "Fair enough," Silas said. They spent the next 3 days in the meadow, nursing Davis back to health while the weather cleared. Silas hunted rabbits with his snares, supplementing their dwindling supplies. Grace kept watch, never fully trusting their former pursuer, always ready to run if needed. Davis, for his part, was cooperative and genuinely remorseful. He told them everything about Blackwell's operation, about the bribes and threats, about the other men who'd been hired to intimidate workers. He described the network of corruption that kept Blackwell in power. "The ledger Grace took, it's the key to everything," Davis said. "Without it, Blackwell is just another mill owner. With it, he goes to prison for murder." On the 4th day, Davis was strong enough to travel. Silas judged the weather stable enough to risk the descent. They packed carefully, rationing supplies for the 3-day journey back to Cedar Ridge. As they prepared to leave, Grace stood at the edge of Martha's meadow, looking out at the snow-covered beauty of it. Silas joined her. "It's peaceful here," she said. "I understand why Martha loved it. Thank you for bringing me here." "Thank you for making it possible for me to come back," Silas replied. "I couldn't face this place alone, but with you, I could remember the good times without drowning in the grief." They descended the mountain together, the old mountain man, the homeless young woman, and the reformed hired gun. It was a strange companionship, born of necessity and danger, but real nonetheless. The journey down was harder than the climb up. Davis was weak, needing frequent rests. The snow made the trail treacherous. But Silas knew every step, every hazard, and he guided them safely through country that had defeated countless others. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they saw Cedar Ridge spread out in the valley below, smoke rising from chimneys, the buildings small and welcoming in the autumn light. "We made it," Grace said, relief flooding her voice. "We did," Silas agreed. "Now comes the hard part, facing whatever consequences await us." They walked into town together, 3 survivors of a mountain storm and a test of character, ready to face whatever judgment came next. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw was on his porch when they walked into town. His eyes widened as he took in the sight of Silas, Grace, and the stranger between them, all 3 looking worn but alive. "Well," Tom said slowly, "that's not what I expected." "Got a story for you, Tom," Silas said, "and a witness who wants to talk." They gathered in the sheriff's office: Silas, Grace, Davis, Doc Wheeler, and Samuel Hemlock. For 2 hours, Davis told everything he knew about Cyrus Blackwell's criminal enterprise. Sheriff Bradshaw took careful notes, his face growing grimmer with each revelation. "I've been in contact with the territorial marshal," Tom said when Davis finished. "They're sending 2 deputies to escort Grace and that ledger to the capital. There'll be a proper investigation, and with your testimony, Mr. Davis, I think we've got a solid case." Davis nodded wearily. "I'll testify. It's the least I can do." "You'll need to stay in Cedar Ridge until the marshals arrive," Tom said. "That all right with you?" "Yes, sir," Davis said quietly. Doc Wheeler examined Davis's frostbitten fingers, shaking his head. "You're lucky Silas found you when he did. Another few hours and you'd have lost these fingers, maybe your hands." "I know," Davis said. "He saved my life when he had every reason not to." Samuel Hemlock spoke up. "We'll find you a place to stay, at least until the marshals come. Can't say folks will be friendly, but you'll have a roof and food." Over the following weeks, Cedar Ridge settled into a new normal. The federal marshals arrived, serious men with stern faces who took statements, examined the ledger, and eventually escorted Grace and Davis to the territorial capital for the formal proceedings. Silas stayed behind, his part in the story complete. He spent his days working on Grace's cabin, preparing it for her return. Samuel Hemlock helped, as did Doc Wheeler, and surprisingly, several other townspeople who'd come to respect what Silas and Grace had done. Mrs. Henley never apologized, but she stopped making disapproving noises when Grace's name was mentioned. That was close enough to acceptance for Silas. 6 weeks later, Grace returned to Cedar Ridge. She stepped off the stagecoach on a cold December morning, carrying her satchel and wearing a new dress, simple but well made. Purchased with money, the territorial government had paid her for her testimony. Silas was waiting at the general store, standing tall with his walking stick in hand. When he saw her, something in his weathered face softened into a smile. "Welcome home," he said. "Home," Grace repeated, testing the word. Then she smiled, bright and genuine. "Yes, it is, isn't it?" They walked together to her cabin. Inside, Grace found it transformed. Silas had added a small table, chairs he'd carved himself, shelves for her few possessions, a wool rug covered the floor, curtains hung in the windows. On the table sat the wooden box he'd made, the one with the carved scene of a woman in a garden. Grace picked it up with trembling hands, opening the lid. Inside were the deed to the land and the bag of seeds, exactly as Silas had promised all those weeks ago. "I can't accept this," Grace said, though her eyes were bright with tears. "You already earned it," Silas replied. 10 times over. The land is yours, free and clear. Build your garden, Grace. Plant those seeds come spring. Make a life here." Grace set down the box and crossed to him, taking his weathered hands in hers. "Only if you help me. Only if we build that garden together." Silas felt his throat tighten. "I'm 67 years old, Grace. You've got your whole life ahead of you. You don't need an old man hanging around." "I need a friend," Grace said firmly. "I need someone who sees me, who understands loss and hope and second chances. I need you, Silas. Not as a father, not as a rescuer, but as a partner in building something good." Silas looked at her, this young woman who'd changed his life, who'd pulled him back from bitterness, who'd given him a reason to stand up and live again. He thought about Martha's letter, about her words urging him to stay open to companionship, to not let old wounds keep him from accepting gifts. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "We'll build it together." That winter was cold but good. Silas taught Grace everything he knew about mountain living, how to read tracks in snow, how to predict weather from cloud formations, how to preserve food and maintain tools. Grace taught him about hope, about laughter, about letting joy back into life after grief. They took meals together most evenings, alternating between their 2 cabins. Grace learned to make the stew Martha used to make, following a recipe Silas remembered from decades past. Silas carved her a walking stick of her own, decorating it with scenes from their journey into the high country. Davis stayed in Cedar Ridge through the winter, helping where he could, working to repay the town for their tolerance. By spring, he'd earned enough trust that Samuel Hemlock offered him permanent work at the general store. Davis accepted gratefully, a man rebuilding his life from mistakes. When spring came, Silas and Grace planted the garden together. They turned the soil, sowed the seeds, built a fence to keep out deer. As the days lengthened and warmed, green shoots emerged from the dark earth, vegetables and flowers, herbs and hope, growing in ground that had waited years for this purpose. One evening in May, as they sat on Grace's porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Grace spoke quietly. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Those 3 years in the wheelchair, the test, all of it?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I regret the bitterness," he said finally. "I regret letting hurt turn me into someone I didn't recognize. But the test itself? No. Because it led me to the most important lesson, that life isn't about proving people are bad or good. It's about choosing to see the good when it appears, and having the courage to trust it." "And did you find it?" Grace asked. Silas looked at her, at the garden growing green in the evening light, at the mountains he'd once known so well and was learning to love again. He thought about Martha's meadow, where he'd finally been able to return and remember without drowning in grief. He thought about the town, slowly accepting him back into their lives. He thought about Davis, working to redeem himself one day at a time. Most of all, he thought about Grace, this young woman who'd seen a lonely old man in a wheelchair and chosen kindness without expecting anything in return. "Yes," Silas said simply, "I found it. Or maybe it found me." Grace smiled and took his hand, her fingers warm in his weathered palm. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into night, 2 people who'd found their way back from loss and loneliness to something like peace. The garden would need tending, the mountains would still be there, calling to them. The town would continue its rhythms of life and work and community. But for now, in this moment, they had enough. They had each other. They had hope. And they had a place to call home. In the distance, an owl called from the pine trees, its voice carrying across the valley. The first stars emerged above the mountains, bright and constant, A gentle breeze carried the scent of growing things, of earth and possibility. Silas had spent 3 years testing humanity, looking for proof of kindness in a world he'd decided was cruel. In the end, kindness hadn't come in the form he'd expected. It hadn't come from the people he'd been watching, the ones who'd known him for decades. It had come from a homeless young woman with nothing to give but her genuine self, who'd seen him not as a test subject or a project, but simply as another person navigating the complicated terrain of life and loss. She'd reminded him that the greatest journeys often begin with the smallest acts of kindness, and that the longest roads home are the ones we walk together. As full darkness settled over Cedar Ridge, Silas and Grace remained on the porch, 2 souls who'd saved each other in ways that had nothing to do with danger or drama, and everything to do with the quiet courage of choosing hope over despair, trust over suspicion, and connection over isolation. The garden would grow, the seasons would turn, life would continue with all its challenges and joys, but they would face it together, and that made all the difference. Sometimes the loneliest people are sitting right in front of us, waiting to be seen. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stop, to sit, to offer water when they have little to spare, to treat another human being with simple, uncomplicated kindness. Grace had done that for Silas. In return, he'd given her a home, protection when she needed it, and the wisdom earned from a long life lived in wild country. But the greatest gift they'd given each other was simpler than any of that. They'd given each other a reason to believe that tomorrow could be better than yesterday, that the world still held goodness, and that it was never too late to start again. As the stars wheeled overhead and the night deepened, Silas Corrigan and Grace Bennett sat together in the darkness, no longer invisible, no longer alone, no longer testing or running or hiding. Just 2 people, sharing a porch and a silence, building a life from seeds and hope and the unshakable belief that kindness, when given freely, can change everything.